Thanks to all who are joining live, and thanks to everyone else who is watching on their own time. We have a pretty sweet chat today with Justin and Rohit on where to build next in AI. And so I think start at the most obvious places, which is letting these two introduce themselves a little bit. So Justin, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'm Justin Uberti. I'm CTO at Fixie.ai. Before sort of coming into the startup space, I was at Google for 15 years, where I sort of led the development of a bunch of our video conferencing technology, and eventually moved toward things like Stadia, where we use the same technology to stream down audio and video. And so I'm kind of really passionate about trying to figure out how we can take that tech and intersect it with this AI space.
Very nice, Rohit.
Hey, my name is Rohit. I've taken a circuitous route, but I used to do a fair bit of ML. Then I went into consulting and investing, which is what I did for the last decade or so, and now getting back into starting a company. A lot of investments in the AI space, as you would imagine.
Yeah, totally. And by the way, I forgot to mention, for anyone that's tuning in live or after the fact and isn't aware of Backdrop Build, we're here as part of this Backdrop Build V2 program. Going to be launching a couple hundred products in AI and crypto next week. So yeah, excited to have everyone here that is pushing towards launching something new. And I actually thought it would be maybe a good place, an interesting place to start. So let's imagine that you guys have. I think you both like experimenting and playing around with tech. I think I spent the weekend, reading Rohit's book and, just checking out some of the experiments that Justin, you've been working on. So if I were to give you 10 extra hours a week, free time, no kids, totally just in flow. What would you experiment with? It doesn't have to be like to build a company, like, or anything, serious, just like pure builder time. What would you kind of spend it on?
You want to go first, Justin? Giving it the easy
Sure.
slot.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, the vision models that have come out, like GPTV, there are others, are in many ways sort of feels to me like their own sort of huge jump forward. Just like we were all blown away by the advent of LLMs and the idea you could have an API to tell it to go generate some text based on some text you gave it. Now we have the same ability to do so for you give it an image, and it can then go think about it and give you results. And I've seen a number of really great demos of people who have kind of used it to make like a sports announcer for a video. You give it like a video of a sporting event, and it'll automatically give you color commentary. Just an example of the type of things you can do. And so I feel, in many ways, like this sort of vision, model is basically going to kick off a whole explosion of new ideas and new things you can do the same way that LLMs did. And so like, we have some ideas on what we want to do here, but we have like, a bunch of stuff we've already committed to. And so like with that 10 extra hours, I'd be like, I just have to go kind of figure out exactly, where the limits of some of this tech are, because I'm super excited about it.
I mean, I agree with sort of Justin. I think with 10 hours, I would probably focus on, I don't know, can I pick two things? I'm going to go with two things. I think one is like, I'm still extremely unclear on how exactly the shapes, sizes of data that you feed into an LLM actually produces the final beneficial output. I think it's I don't think it's just me. I think everyone's struggling with it, but I feel like it's one of the probably most critical things to understand when we think about, training our own or fine tuning our own or whatever. I'd spend a chunk of time on that. I think that would be my first answer. The second one, which is something I'm personally excited about, is one of the weird things about LLMs is that I call it a fuzzy processor, right? Which is that like you throw in a bunch of data in all sorts of unstructured format, and it can structure it in some ways and give it back to you. But the thing is, like, it's probabilistic, and it doesn't do it as well as you would want it to every time. And in fact, that's both its strength and its weakness. And I'd want it to play around and create APIs for all sorts of things. I mean, 95%, 99% of stuff that happens inside a company is like two monolithic, uh, uh, whatever, call it databases, programs, whatever, trying to interface with each other, even people interfacing with each other. once you have something that can actually stitch those two things together, like you genuinely can start to automate enormous chunks, right? So I know, like UiPath tried to do this a little bit with its conceptualization of bots maybe a decade ago, but we finally can actually do that properly. That's the second thing that I would play with.
Yeah. Justin, I think I guess you can't divulge any secrets about. Sounds like there's some things coming down the pipe for Fixie, but are there any products that you feel like you would just love someone to build that you haven't seen yet? You feel like are low hanging fruit?
And from a product standpoint, I think that we're focusing a lot on sort of voice and vision technology, and I think there's a lot of interesting verticals into which this technology can go. We think we can be a really good substrate. The stuff we've done at voice.fixie.ai gives an example of how you could use voice technology to basically be in like a drive-through, of a sort of hypothetical drive-through, and like if there's ever a situation where you have a human who is basically listening to text or speech and then taking that and putting it into a computer, that seems like a scenario that's ripe for automation. And so I think there's a lot of interesting verticals where you could go and take this tech and come up with something very, very quickly that would be able to provide a lot of value. And we've seen a lot of sort of interest. I mentioned the sort of the drive-through case, but people who are booking appointments or whatever. Plenty of places where this tech could fall in. But I think there's a lot of other just even more interesting things, like a comedy bot that could actually write jokes and put together a bit of a routine based on some training on existing comedians or whatever. That's the kind of thing I'd love to be able to see. I think comedy might be beyond the reach of current LLMs, just because they try to make a joke and then you're like, do I just not get it? The punchline is not quite there. But I do wonder if maybe training on some or fine tuning on a specific set of comedy routines might be, you might give it the kind of the direction it needs to kind of have something that's maybe more on the money for, its punchlines. So anyway, I think the tech is all there to build something like that. And like, if you could do that, it would be a hit.
Yeah, maybe I did want to double click on this drive-through example, because there's something that we see a lot. So let's say that let's imagine you're a builder, and you kind of identify this opportunity to, you're like, oh my gosh, Starbucks should totally be replacing all of their drive-through people with AI agents. Like, this is goldmine, or maybe not a goldmine, but this is a clear opportunity, let's say. And like, you guys just published a demo where you show how it could work and how you can kind of construct that agent to respond in the right ways and not answer weird questions. And so that's really cool. But it's difficult sometimes because one of the reasons that it seems like a lot of the the interesting products are either coming out of incumbents who are like, you're Starbucks, right? And you're like, hey, we want to test out a new agent, or you're building infrastructure. And so you're like, okay, we're Fixie and we're building a tool for you to create agents of any kind. But then there's this kind of gap in the middle where I might be like, yes, I would love to create this, interesting drive-through agent, but then I have it and it's like, what do I do with it? So I guess let's just imagine that builder exists, in this room. What might you advise them? It sounds like one thing is well, you can always kind of trim down the idea to okay, you create the comedy bot, and that thing can be a sort of consumer product that you can just get out there and maybe has some traction, and maybe it helps you build momentum towards whatever the bigger thing. But yeah, maybe if you have this clear idea for this drive-through bot, what would you advise that person?
Well, the drive-through bot was really just a technical demo, kind of grounding it a little bit in a real use case, to just kind of create a bit of the illusion of where this could be used. But the whole thing is that it should feel very natural, and it should feel like this is the kind of thing that you could imagine very easily this being put into production. And so our sort of belief is that the investments we've made in our technology are really around creating a very lifelike and fast set of interactions, and that you can glue a lot of these pieces together by hand and come up with something. Like if you're at you have an existing business and you want to try to like do some demos, then like cool. It's very easy to put together something that kind of works, but to get something that really feels like you're talking to a human with the type of conversational latency and kind of expressiveness that you would expect, it requires a lot more effort. And so, generally, like, if I were a builder, like, what would I want to do? I'd want to put together some sort of hero demo or hero video that shows off like how is this better than what you could just build in an hour, and chances are that you've had some insight of like there are problems where people say, oh, how do you handle like interruptions, or how do you handle the fact that like it can be slow, or how do you handle the fact that like you just can't get a good punchline out of an LLM, and you say, well, we solved that. Here's the sort of demo we put together saying like, oh, no one else is doing this, and we figure out kind of a trick to come up with like how to get past like this obstacle, and just like those things can go viral very quickly.
Yeah, totally. Maybe like switching gears like a tiny bit. It sounds like I guess I spent the weekend digging through some of the stuff that both of you have been reading, exploring, and I think for everyone, I'll just plug. Rohit has an amazing book called Building God, which is kind of all about understanding, how AI works. It was written for people who are making decisions that are maybe not necessarily themselves like, ML engineers, which is great. And I think Justin, like if you go through Justin's Twitter timeline, like there's a lot of math and there's a lot of testing out different, models and latencies. I mean, I guess Justin, you're an engineer. I think it's fair to say, but at the same time, I think like I think both of you are, especially Justin and Fixie, like you're kind of building tools to help people interact with AI with almost like without knowing anything about it. So I feel like it's one of these like, kind of crude recommendations, like, oh, you should either go like closer to the metal, like you should learn about how it actually works under the hood, or it's like, if you're learning how to write code, like stop because it's going to be obsolete. Like you should just go as close on as far on the other direction as possible, just to like building products. So I guess like maybe, how do you think about like, when people should be digging into the underlying tech? Or what do you think the use cases or usefulness of that is for you all has been versus like really just kind of abstracting away a lot of that complexity?
Rohit, you want to take a shot?
So yeah, I think the one way that I kind of wonder about it is I feel like once you abstract into questions like should you learn to code it, or at that layer it becomes much less useful, because I think those are like, I mean, maybe not, nobody can tell the future, but the question is a little bit more like, we have this new thing, right? That can do a bunch of stuff. Now, the interesting thing is like the boundaries of what can it do, what can it not do, how well can it do the things that it's supposed to do. All of this is unclear. Like this is, the reason this time it's really interesting is because nobody has a very good grasp on what it can do. And that includes the people who are building it, which is great, right? So this is kind of like the tinkerer's domain. And it hasn't really existed, I think, on like maybe when you go back to like people were homebrew analysts, homebrew computer club when they were kind of building it, or like when, early days of internet when you could hack together something and all of a sudden you've discovered sort of a core truth. I think it's closer to that than like, I don't know, the mobile era or the SaaS era, where like if you already knew how to do something, you could learn a new language and get up to speed and do it. And as a consequence of that, I think understanding how things work under the hood is important, because that's useful for you to kind of figure out what you can experiment with. But at the same time, like we're talking about sort of two different things. One is you have some sort of an idea where the need kind of exists. Like we're talking about the drive-through example, just to kind of stick with that for a second. We know what the process looks like and the problem looks like, right? And there are many ways of kind of integrating LLMs and seeing whether that actually can be solved. Like, can the conversations understand everybody that it's talking to? Can it like, what percentage of orders can it translate into actual orders without sort of a layoff? And when do you need to put in a yes, no question just to make sure that you understand? Like there's a bunch of sort of questions that you have to answer. And the only way you know how to sort of answer them is if you understand a little bit about the underlying technology that you want to go with. But the second bit is like, this allows you to just do a bunch of stuff that you wouldn't have thought to do before. And like, you might, play around with creating a comedy bot is not something that like would have been in the realm of possibility before. And now you can play with it and see like, what does this mean? Turns out, like, I mean, it might turn out that if you play with it, you get really good at like getting cadences, but you're really bad at getting punchlines. And that's an interesting observation that you would not get until you actually play with it, right? Because what that means is that it can understand the voice modulation part of it, like it extracts that signal, but it doesn't quite extract the idea that humans love punchlines, which are deviations from some norm. I'm sort of extrapolating and guessing, but as opposed to sort of, the probabilistic token guessing is not getting it close enough to actually being able to create a proper comedy bot. So to me, like put those two things together, what that tells me is like, A, it is a like the deck is stacked towards people who want to play with it in many ways, even more than like the people who are phenomenal at coding and who themselves get like 50% faster, but people who don't know coding are going 0 to 1 way more, right? So I feel in a weird way there's a leveling of the playing field, and the question is almost entirely about, A, are you excited to jump around and mess in it, and B, like, are you able to identify interesting, curious problems that you can sort of play with? And some of them will turn out to be billion-dollar companies, and some of them will turn out to be like curios that you love and you can kind of keep on your desktop. But like, there, I don't think we know really clearly where it's going to land, if that makes sense. But the playing around is the important part.
Do you have any ways that, I mean, when you're allowing yourself kind of the ability to play around, like, do you constrain the space at all? Because I guess at this point, the surface area of where you can play is also expanding exponentially. So, different kinds of models, video, voice, like, at some point it might be
Yeah.
like you're kind of lost. I mean, you're like in a room full of toys and you're playing with each one for like a second and then moving on to the next one. Like, so do you have a way that you try to limit yourself, or just kind of just follow whatever feels natural?
I mean, personally, I use curiosity, my curiosity as the strongest driver that I have here. So I haven't really played much with voice just because, I don't know, for whatever reason, it hasn't hit my curiosity threshold. I played a little bit with vision and a lot more with text because, I don't know, I just like it and I think it is cool. And it'll vary for different people, as it very well should, because that's the only way we get all of the cool stuff that we want to get from here, right? If you think about the science fiction future, 10, 20, 100 years in the future, and you want to kind of get there, you have to do everything. So we all have to figure out what we like. I don't think you can do a top-down answer, I guess, to your question.
Justin, how about you? Do you have any, guidelines for yourself in terms of where to play?
I mean, I think the whole thing about curiosity that Rohit mentioned is totally true. That I think generally, if you're looking for a great way to build something that's interesting and valuable, at least in my own experience, has been find something you really care about and think is interesting and cool, and like more so maybe even than something that seems like people say, oh, this is a good area for investment, because two things, like one, what you'll be doing will maybe be a little bit off the beaten path, and there won't be so many people, it'll be so crowded, everyone trying to get in there. And second, like when it gets hard, you'll have the motivation to go and try to figure out like how to like get through challenges, and you'll notice interesting things that other people don't notice. And if it turns out that your guess is right, that what you are working on is actually cool, you'll sort of be way out ahead before like everyone says, oh, here's an area you should be exploring. So like I definitely agree with that. I also sort of think that the notion of trying to really understand the tech at a more fundamental level, at least in terms of building like a working model of how the stuff operates, is pretty critical. That right now, like we're building these abstractions around these things, but these abstractions are pretty incomplete in a lot of ways. And so the way you get like really next level sort of performance a lot of times is that you understand the tech well enough to know that, oh, the abstraction is kind of covering up this piece that, if I could just get access to this thing underneath, I could do some much, I can make these pieces fit together much better. And, for example, some of the stuff around LLMs, there's been this new technique called speculative decoding that's come out over like the past several months. and it speeds up, decoding by like, or token generation by like 2x, sometimes even more. And it's really like a little bit unintuitive when you first think about it, but then once you understand, it's like, oh, of course, that makes a ton of sense. And it just requires kind of getting access a little bit underneath the API layer that you typically presented for a large language model. And so like, having ability to kind of, say, oh, here's the API, but underneath I know it's doing this. And then you can say, well, if I just had this one change, I could deliver the experience that I'm really looking for. Let me go see if I can talk to someone or get access to some open source so I could fiddle with this. And now you do it and it's like, wow, now it really works. Like that's the way that the real magic, I think, gets created. And so in this area where like everything is so new and the abstractions are so, they haven't really been tested, I think there's an enormous opportunity to do that.
Yeah, one thing I'm curious if this will resonate, but it seems like so that looking for like the right problems to solve is something, and like if you have like some kind of mental model for what kind of problems are maybe interesting, and it strikes me at least that a lot of people are looking right now for kind of like human problems where you maybe would like to replace the human. So if we go back to like the drive-through example, that's a human problem. The Starbucks whatever person can take your order just fine, but you would maybe like for that person to not have to do that, and then it's cheaper for you to have this agent that can do it. Any problem like that, like what I would, I guess, call it like clone problems, where it's like you'd like to just clone the human, and then or maybe clone 1,000 of the humans. And even like a lot of ChatGPT is kind of like this. Like I can, if I had 1,000 people who could like troll the internet for me, they could maybe return the same results. It's just obviously I can't have 1,000 people, so it's really nice that I have ChatGPT. I guess I'm curious in if you have any mental models for problems that are maybe a little bit different, so that they are kind of like uniquely human-ish problems. So I guess one that is or like top of mind for me is like humans are notoriously, and this is I guess a good like specific question for you, Justin, around agents. It's like humans are emotional, right? So if I have like the airline agent at the airport, like, and I miss and my flight is canceled, like, and I am take all my rage out on this person, like at some point that person will just get frustrated and take it personally and snap at me and maybe give me a worse experience. But like, whereas an AI agent will not have that. They're not emotional, like they're not self-conscious in that kind of way. So if I knew this thing was an AI, I would actually prefer for it to be an AI so I can take all my rage out on it without feeling guilty. So I guess I'm curious, like, do you have any sort of ways of thinking about kinds of problems that are kind of like uniquely solvable, not just via like replicating a human type interaction, but actually like it should be a machine, if that makes sense?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because, a lot of objections you might get for having someone be in this sort of situation or an agent be in the situation where it's sort of, acting like it's a human is that people say, oh, I don't want to talk to this. I want to talk to a real person. And, you might have business owners saying, well, how can I sort of feel like this is actually going to be doing what I expect of my human staff? But when we've talked to people after seeing some of these things deployed, the actual sort of, humans talking to it rate it better than an actual human. And the actual people who are deploying these agents say it does a better job than even their best human agents. And the reason why is that it doesn't, it's able to, from the, say, customer support or the human calling inside, it gives you like on median a better quality answer, a better experience than like median human in many cases. And from the business side, it sticks to the instructions, it sticks to the script, it is accessing knowledge bases, it just has a better memory than even the best humans. And so like on both sides, it gives like a more valuable experience. Now, I do think there's this sort of question of somebody calls in, their flight's been canceled, they're very upset. And like you do need to make sure that the agent has been kind of configured, or prepared in such a way that it can really try to empathize and say, oh, that I understand it's really frustrating. Let me see what I can go do to help. I'm going to go check in on this for you. And I think that whole notion needs to be embedded in the sort of development process of like everything from the voice that's used, it should sound human and not robotic, to the sort of words that are used. It should sound like the way a human would talk to you, which is not through some like business ease or jargon, but more like, yes, I understand that's like really important for you to get to your destination and everything. But I think this stuff is all within reach. I think that one of the things that I think I find myself, even having worked with this technology for a while now, continually surprised by is by the humanness a lot of times of this of the output that's generated by the LM based on the situational setup. And it's like, wow, okay, you don't have to do a lot, to basically tell it like, don't react inappropriately, because it's read all the sort of thing of how humans interact with each other, and with given enough context, it can know, yes, empathy is requisite here. So anyway, I think there's a lot of interesting parts of how you can build an experience that really delivers like, okay, both sides came away from this conversation feeling like, yeah, my needs were met, they were understood, and I got a proper resolution.
Yeah, I guess it would be fair. I mean, like we could bucket those examples that you gave under the like really good human kind of like output, where it's like the experience that you want as an end user is like, I want to think that this agent is like a really, really good human. Like it's very, very good at like knowing what I want or giving me the right information, or it's very, very good at being empathetic and understanding me. And so it's like kind of like LARPing as like the best possible human. Like, and then we could think about another like set of problems where it's like, actually it's like a very good robot. So it's like I know full well, and almost like I might even want, instead of it being stamped with like the fair trade thing, it's like it's stamped with like, hey, don't worry, this is not a human. Like this is for sure a robot. We're not just using humans underneath. Like, and I actually want that. Like, so I guess like, have you seen any experiments that are more in that latter bucket that are interesting? And like, I guess long term, how do you think about like, the opportunity for both?
I mean,
Jump in, yeah.
one way to think about it is like a sufficient change in scale kind of changes scope. So if you could get 1,000 humans and talk to them about 1,000 different things on sort of a chatbot. However, if you need input on a sufficiently diverse number of topics and you need it fast, and the response has to be sub, I don't know, 1 second, that is like superhuman, right? So I think a little bit like the Marvel universe, right? I mean, is Captain America sufficiently human? Is he superhuman? Or like, where do we kind of place him in that trajectory? At some point, if you're fast enough and you're strong enough and like everything in the world, then like you could kind of still say like, oh yeah, we understand the axes and it's kind of like a human, is just much better. But it becomes really hard to kind of bucket them into those domains. I think what we can do is to say like, hey, if we do have these capabilities, you're able to do a bunch of things that humans just can't do. Like an example might be having a bot that can simultaneously respond across multiple languages to multiple people, as they need fluently, which is, it's also like a human-ish problem, but it is clearly superhuman in what you're asking it to do sort of quickly. If you wanted to act like a robot, I mean, one of the big problems in the like when the APIs first launched were that in order to get structured output from them was really hard, right? We all want, I don't know, you wanted it to give you JSON format and it just wouldn't. It kind of hallucinates and add things at the end, etc., which makes it really hard for you to use it for specific purposes if you wanted to act as glue within your systems, or you want to get structured output that you can use elsewhere. And that didn't exist, and that was really hard for us to kind of get. But once that comes through, then you can rely on it to act like a robot with the creativity of a human, if that makes sense, which is a hybrid that, again, an enormous number of human professions are basically us asking humans to use their creativity and ask like robots. I mean, lawyers and accountants, I apologize, but it comes to mind. But it's also true of a large number of jobs. Doctors, in many instances, act similarly. So, like, to me, sort of, it is a blend of these different factors in new ways creates sufficiently new kind of abilities, shall we say, that like you're able to build things that you just would not have been able to build before. And that might kind of, because at the end, at one end of the LLM interface, then the ones that we are talking about is still us. So we would still want it to like talk to us and like emote with us, or like, fake emote if that's what's needed, or like use language and all of those things that we would actually want it to do. But at the same time, you have to rely on it to say, like, instead of just talking to like, Joey and Justin, I wanted to also talk with Slack, and I wanted to talk with Gmail, and I wanted to talk with Salesforce. It can't use the same language, right? It has to kind of structure its output in a way. So I don't know if you would call that sort of cloning a human, but it creates enough new capabilities that like you're able to plug them into a lot of holes where you previously might not even have known that you have holes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. At a certain point, it's like, I guess a good way to put it, it's like, we would think of ourselves in relation to a superhuman a little bit differently, Captain America, than a sort of standard human. And I guess we're so familiar, we know how to talk to Captain America like we talk to our friend.
Right.
So it's like there's that interesting edge between like familiarity and like these maybe agents will always feel human-like because that it's just easier for us to know how to interact with them, but they will also like clearly be different in some ways.
I mean, one way to think about it is like you can ask, I don't know, diffusion models to create any sort of new art that you would like. That is, call it a pastiche if you want, but like it does create incredible pieces, right? At the end of the day. Now, could a human have created them? Of course, like that's not an argument. But the question is not could a human have created them, but the question is could a human have created them in the, I don't know, 3 seconds that it takes it to kind of render a brilliant new artwork and show it to me. I think once you sufficiently stretch the scope of time as well as scale, it becomes superhuman. At least that's how I think about it.
I mean, I agree with that. I think that there's also the notion of like in 3 seconds, maybe you didn't get the exact final form that you wanted, but you got some interesting ideas that kind of made you think, hey, this is an interesting direction. And then you can go explore those. And just like that sort of riffing and cycle process just becomes much, much shorter. Like in the end, like the human is still the art director, so to speak here, but the just the ability to take an idea that's conceived inside your mind and then like realize it in some form to kind of understand, is this kind of exactly what I wanted, and just have that process go quickly. The time scales are incredibly short.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think like one of the things that I just like feels very top of mind for us is it is so easy to experiment now, and I guess Justin, you probably have a lot of experience with this because you're lowering the cost to launching something new by a lot, right? Or like that's part of the promise. And I think we see this path for a lot of people where it's like spin up the MVP or the wrapper or the whatever, like in a couple of weeks, and then if that thing seems interesting, maybe you can train your own custom model underneath, or you can start like branching off and finding some interesting traction that like makes sense. I think the hardest part for people, it seems, especially, is like that initial step, which is like, because there's so much noise at this point, and I think I'm not sure people are quite even ready for how noisy it's about to get, because there are still some like last little bits of friction, to launching that new thing, to that idea. But those bits of friction seem like they're dissolving pretty rapidly. So I think it feels like one of the hardest things is how do you find, it doesn't have to be the ultimate thing that you're going to do, but the initial thing that has like the core ingredients of you're learning the right things, you have some initial momentum, it's going to carry you, or maybe you're learning about the problem that you care about, it's going to carry you to the next iteration. Like that's like the hardest part. So I don't know. I guess like maybe Justin or Rohit, like you support a lot of, especially Justin, like a lot of builders that are in that moment, let's say. What have you seen people do well to just find that like nugget of something that can become the next thing?
One thing I think is just, yeah, I think I'll come back to the notion about, Rohit mentioned about the, working with like these image generators, just as an example, not to be specific around image generation, but the fact that, in 3 seconds, you can get a new image based on the text you typed in to see like, is this does this look good? Like, does it come up with like a good output for this prompt? And I think building on a platform is very similar to that you're saving yourself a ton of time. Maybe it's not 3 seconds to get up and running, but maybe you can get up and running in 15 minutes or something. And so if you have an idea of like, oh, I want to build this agent, or I want to build this new application, if you're building top of a platform, the time from idea conception in your mind to actually seeing it running on like a web page or phone or whatever, is much shorter. It's in minutes, not days. And so you can quickly refine, oh, I thought this was going to feel a lot better when I actually played with it. Let me, go back and mess with it some more, or this doesn't really seem like a promising direction. Let me go try something different. So rather than having to kind of build from the like, ex nihilo, as I like to say, you can basically just get up and get something running on these platforms. And so I'd encourage everyone to, if you're basically trying to figure out like what's the right thing to go build, to start with that sort of thing. I mean, eventually you may find yourself, as I mentioned before, you're limited by the abstraction that you need to do something that the platform doesn't allow you to do, or it's difficult to do, or you need to control things in one way or shape or form or another, and you need to get underneath, and then maybe you go and like do the hard work to rebuild it and run it yourself. But I mean, it's pretty amazing, what a lot of these platforms can do right now in terms of just like getting up and running, and just the feel of seeing an application fully run end to end for the first time. It's hard to overstate. Just getting that whole experience and interacting with it is for like proving out an idea.
Yeah, maybe. Or Guru, do you want to jump in?
I was just about to say that, like, I think we've had a few public conversations now about wrappers, right? Which is sort of, I don't know. On the one hand, I sort of despise the term. On the other hand, it kind of points a little bit to the fact that sometimes the moats are shallow, which is kind of what this means, right? I think one way to think about it is like the entire history of technology is like increasing the speed and reducing the time for you to kind of get your idea into some realistic output. It happened first with hardware, and then with software, then with cloud, and now sort of with AI. I mean, you can think of it as a continuum. I think the one way kind of I look at it is like there's a level of extra effort or insight that you have to put into a problem that allows you to kind of create the product that can't easily be copied by someone else with 100 lines of Python code. And I mean, that just seems almost trivial to say, but I don't know. That's pretty straightforward in terms of sort of what's required. The second way to think about it, for me at least, is like, the question realistically, to Justin's point, this is where you kind of need to understand what's actually happening so that you can figure out where you want to kind of build your castle in some sense. Like, do you need to build your own model, or are you going to create a company that is entirely focused on infrastructure side so that others can build their own, or do you want to kind of bring custom data, and that is where the magic happens? Do you want to do it on the training side in front? Like, there are enough dark corners that you can figure out a way for you to create interesting answers. There's the simple answers like, I don't know, we will allow you to search across all of your customer records, or things of that nature, which are presumably too simplistic, and the incumbents can easily kind of come and take a bite out of you, as has happened, right? Including OpenAI and everyone else. So the question very much is one of like, where do you want to kind of set and build your particular castle? And as we go forward, I presume like there will be more nooks and crannies, because the chances that there will be one model to win them all, I think, is pretty low. Especially after the events of the last weekend, I don't think anyone wants to rely on a single API call to kind of satisfy everything. Fast handoffs are important. Multiple models talking to each other is important. All of which can require either for you to put in efforts, or like you to construct these things so that you actually have a system whereby even if the chips are replaceable, the actual chipset or the overall OS is no longer replaceable. So you can sort of build modes over time.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is kind of even answering a little bit Roger's question, which is like, where are we heading into, more nooks and crannies? And I guess like, in this like AI wrapper, bad kind of like lack of nuanced argument. It strikes me a little bit that it kind of lacks, yeah, it just lacks like the nuance that's on the ground, which is that there's a lot of like survivor bias where, I mean, if you're a VC, or maybe these are the loudest voices in the room saying like, well, look at all these companies that are getting funded and maybe they're gonna, flame out because their moats aren't, deep enough. But if you look at the reverse problem, which is like people not experimenting, like not launching the thing, like not actually finding something that people care about, I think that latter problem is way bigger, like generally speaking. So there's too many people, put another way, too many people sitting in the room thinking about like what is the perfect product that has like all these deep moats and it's just never going to be, I'm never going to get the rug pulled out from under me, and it's just, it's like I think there's too many people actually doing that versus like, getting something into people's hands, iterating quickly, and et cetera. So kind of like to Justin, to your point, I mean, there's lots of nuance in that, of course, and it depends on what your perspective is, if you're, investing versus building. But yeah, I does feel like this, like, AI wrapper is a horrible like business. I just don't feel like it really has a lot of reality when you look at what's happening.
Maybe one sort of nuanced comment might be that like an outcome of this could very well be that individual developers or small teams can build non-VC scale businesses that nevertheless do remarkably well across an enormous number of niches. That is a likely outcome that doesn't really get talked about a huge amount because, you know, we all love talking about the $10 billion outcomes and not necessarily the $100 million outcomes, but like nothing to sneeze at, right? I mean, in some ways, I think I might be wrong about this, but I feel like from Microsoft days, uh, more money than Microsoft made, like more money on the OSs were made by the resellers and sort of the people who installed, etc., compared to sort of Microsoft made by some margin. And I don't see why something similar can't happen here, right? Like, and because ultimately it's all about, can you implement a version of this thing in like this problem, and nothing ever fits perfectly, which means you have to make it work, and ultimately somebody is going to have to make that work. Usually it's not the user, which means for anything one step above chat from a consumer perspective, you're probably going to get more niches where you will see new species develop, keeping with the analogy.
I think one other thing is that in the early days, like everything basically gets described as a thin wrapper because you only have enough time to build like a fairly thin layer. But over time, if you are digging in the right place, one of two things happens: either that your wrapper kind of expands, like take for example in like AWS, it's like, okay, you're a wrapper around like VMs. Okay, well, either like it turns out there's a lot more there, and your thin layer becomes very thick, and there's a lot of value there, or it turns out that as you're building the layer, you find something else that's a really interesting unlock, and suddenly, in addition to having your wrapper, you also have some hard tech, some unique IP that's in there as well. But you just have to start somewhere. I know some companies that we're basically doing text to speech stuff. And they're largely reselling existing text-to-speech from other providers. And they're providing like a studio in some ways that some UI are essentially around like thin wrapper, around like the generated audio. But by understanding more about what people are using it for, they use those insights to build their own text-to-speech model. And now they have one of the best text-to-speech models out there. So the bottom line is like, yeah, thin wrappers are hard to defend. But either like again, your wrapper grows up, it gets thick, you build your own IP, or the other thing is you get an audience. Like having a great end user product, is like the most sticky thing, maybe more than anything else. That in a right thick mode. When the iPhone came out and Instagram was created, people said, oh, who's gonna pay $1 billion for Instagram for a thing that makes your photos look worse? Well, it turns out that was like a thin wrapper on the iPhone camera. In many ways, but they figured out a little unlock of the sharing aspect, and they've had an audience. And so I still think there's not an opportunity for that. We still haven't found like what is the Instagram of this platform shift.
Yeah, I want to make sure we grab a couple other I think if I understand this question from Jacob well, like it's about basically whether people should be, more learning how to program because it's the way that we need to, move past these kind of thin solutions. And I think this is probably one of those questions that is more like dependent on you. But I guess I'm curious, like, yeah, how do you think about the importance of learning how to program, over time?
I mean,
I mean, I think
I don't know how
go ahead,
much
go
in the
ahead.
future you want to go, but like, I find it hard to believe that you won't have to know something about how to program. I mean, these things are getting more complicated. You want to debug them, you pretty much need to know how to program. You will probably have a larger surface area of people who program much less compared to sort of a smaller surface area of extremely deep programmers. But that's, I don't know, is that more programming or less? That's kind of.
Yeah, I think about it of, I much like my ability to remember and like what is the function syntax for like some obscure thing in Python or Rust or whatever is like that's gone. Like if I don't know, I can just ask Copilot chat or whatever, and it'll just fill it in for me. But the ability to sort of fit pieces together and understand like what is the overall experience I'm trying to build, like I think it is more important than ever, and especially because like there is some area where it's, oh, I don't know how to go turn up this like VM on AWS or whatever. I can just ask my Copilot now for help. And so I think my sort of reach or abilities as like a programmer are now enhanced by these augmenting tools, and just the ability to kind of think logically and decompose things into individual pieces is more important than ever, I would say. So like to say programming is going to be out and we're all just going to be designing everything by talking to a computer, sure. But when we talk to the computer, we're going to have to explain in a very careful, way, like how the system should overall work. And there's a great essay by Dijkstra on exactly like this. So like, it doesn't remove the need to think, even if like, you eventually just are talking to a computer in natural language.
Yeah, it always strikes me the difference between like programming versus engineering, which is like there's a process of engineering something which is very specific, and if you talk to an engineer, it doesn't actually really matter what kind of engineering they're doing. Like they will have a way of thinking through edge cases and thinking through like how solutions are built and etc. And if programming like goes away or gets less, the people that are going to be best at engineering in whatever way we're engineering things in the future are still going to be the engineers, because I think it's the same way. So I think the question is like, what is the best way for you to get really good at engineering solutions right now? That's kind of up to you to figure out. That could be writing a lot of code. It could be doing no code stuff. Like I think the more important thing is that if that's what you like doing and want to do, that you're doing it, like, and you're doing it in products that are actually getting into people's hands. I think that's, to me at least, like that's the sort of like simpler answer. Yeah.
I think one way to also add to
Best way,
that is that, sorry, Justin, you go.
I think the best way to learn about building is building.
100%.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that also that like the I mean, programming has changed, to Justin's point, dramatically, and it has changed sort of over the years as well. It's just not right now. I think there's a difference between what you might consider, I don't know, like what you might have called programming sort of 5 years ago is not similar to what a lot of people would think of as programming right now. So it's an evolving spectrum, right? And at some point, like there might come a future where nobody really needs to, and we can kind of like chat with it and get entire apps that we want or whatever we want out of it. We're not there yet. So like, sure, we can assume that that will come and sort of do nothing at the moment. That's an acceptable, logical conclusion, but isn't the more fun conclusion to actually try and build it with whatever tools you have and
Totally.
see what happens?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end. And probably like, I guess if I were to replay that, it's like, if you're the kind of person who is like, I'm not going to learn to do anything now because I just want to wait 5 years because then I will be able, it'll be easier. Like maybe you should be asking the question of whether that's really something that you want to be doing, period. Like, if, because that like passion to build something that's what you need, and that's not going to go anywhere, as the technology changes. So I think that's probably a good, very resonant, I guess, with kind of the vibe of our program. Sorry, did you want to add another thing? Oh, okay. Well, let's end it there. I think because we got to move to actually have another event coming up. We're going to talk about crypto as well. So lots of wild and crazy worlds on the other side. I think if you have more questions for these two, definitely find them on Twitter. Go read Rohit's book. Go build some stuff with Fixie. It's great. And yeah, thanks to both you for joining, spending time with us. Really appreciate it. Yeah, we'll see everyone soon.
My pleasure.
Likewise.